This video is looking at Othello's soliloquy in Act 3, Scene 3. And this is really the first time that we've heard from Othello by himself, and it shows exactly how much Iago's influence is starting to take hold of him and starting to cause that kind of conflict and upset to him. Now, the way this video is going to work is that, first of all, we'll look at almost translating the soliloquy into modern English. So if you're looking at really trying to understand what Othello's saying, I'd make sure that you've got a copy of the text and that you're just making notes in terms of what's being said and how to think about it. So Othello's by himself on stage, and I've referred to this as a soliloquy. And what you should do is just have a little note somewhere that talks about the fact that a soliloquy is one character on stage, normally thinking through some degree of psychological conflict. Okay, so the character who is delivering the soliloquy has got something to worry about, something to try and work out in their mind as they are speaking. It's also a convention, so a rule or an expectation, a convention that a character delivering a soliloquy is telling the truth, okay? Because if you think they are kind of on one level talking to themselves, obviously we as audience are sitting listening to it, but they're telling the truth because they are mulling over, considering their own thoughts. So when we listen to what Othello's saying, we have to take the view that we are hearing really what he currently thinks at this moment. Now we know that Iago has just left. Okay, Iago has in Act 3, Scene 3, really gained a lot of ground in terms of his plan. He started off just very briefly at the start of this scene saying, "Oh, I like not that," when he sees Cassio talking to Desdemona. Now, he knows that Cassio is talking to Desdemona because he's advised Cassio to do that to try and get his job back, to try and get Desdemona to intervene on his behalf with Othello. And that doesn't work because Othello just says, "Oh, yeah, I think it's Cassio." And there's no suspicion at all. So during the course of Act 3, Scene 3, Iago kind of starts to drop in all of these different ideas until finally he's kind of, leaving Othello with the idea, just keep an eye on Cassio, watch Desdemona, see how they react. If she starts to argue for him, well, maybe. So Othello has really got this kind of doubt in his mind about Desdemona, but is more convinced that Iago is on his side. So if we just look at that section that I've just turned yellow, this fellow is Iago. And Othello says he's not just honest, but he's of exceeding honesty. He is incredibly honest. There is an excess. There is almost too much honesty about him. He also knows all the qualities of human dealings with a learned spirit. So he really thinks that Iago knows everything there is to know about people, about humanity, about how people behave. That's kind of important because we've already established from Iago that the Moor is of a free and open nature, that does think men honest, but he seemed to be so. Okay, so he's already been established as very trusting. And he trusts Iago. You've also got the idea that Othello is an outsider in Venice and Venetian society. And that is something that Iago is also using as a weapon. Iago is dropping hints to Othello that, look, you don't know how Venetian women behave. I know how Venetian women behave. You know, I'd hate to think you taken advantage of because you didn't know they did this. So Othello now has this view of Iago as being a really good person to turn to for advice on people. And he moves from that observation on Iago to thinking about Desdemona. And this section is kind of strange image to us because actually it's using old fashioned imagery from falconry, okay, from hawks and things. So if you look, I'll just put the note there, falconry. And to translate it, he says, if I prove her haggard, and a haggard was an untamed young female hawk. Okay, so he says, you know, if I prove her haggard, if I prove her to be this wild young bird, even though her jesses, and that word jesses, if you think of a bird of prey that's being trained by somebody, think of that side when you see somebody with their arm out and a bird on it. When the bird is young and can't be trusted not to fly away, it's tied to the owner's wrist. And those strings are jesses, okay, the straps on a hawk for training. So Othello says, if, you know, I prove her a wild young hawk, even though her strings were my own heartstrings, okay, I'd whistle her off. And that is, again, a kind of idea from falconry to give that signal to the bird to fly away, right? And rather than, you know, commanding the bird to go out and come back, Othello says, well, if her straps were my heartstrings, if she's untamable, I'll send her away and I'll let her down the wind. I'll let her fly off to prey at fortune. So I'll let her go into the wild. I'll release her and let her take her chances. Okay, so that really is quite kind of a step from the Othello who said that, you know, chaos would come again if he didn't love her anymore. Then he moves to kind of next idea. It says, happily, for I am black and have not those soft parts of conversation that chamberers have, or for I am declined into the vale of years, yet that's not much. She's gone. Okay, and these are Othello's doubts starting to really kind of influence his mind. So he says, maybe it's my race. Okay, maybe it's my colour. And maybe I don't have those charming manners, those soft parts of conversation that the politicians or the kind of smoother talking people have. Or maybe it's because I've sunk into my years. Maybe it's because I'm older than she is. Maybe I'm too old for her. And then he catches himself and says, no, that's not much. You know, so he's thinking maybe, maybe not, maybe, maybe not. And then in the middle of this doubt comes, she's gone. Okay. And all of a sudden he becomes convinced that actually, yes, he's lost her. You know, whatever one of these reasons, then she's gone. And that really is a kind of turning point of his thinking, because he really does persuade himself that actually there's nothing more he can do. She's got to be betraying him. And he says, I am abused and my relief must be to loathe her. So I'm wronged and the only thing open to me to make this better is to hate her. Okay, so loathe is hate, right? And then he makes a kind of wider point. O curse of marriage. Oh, wrong style of pen. There we go. O curse of marriage, that we can call these delicate creatures ours and not their appetites. So marriage is cursed, that delicate creatures, little beings, delicate beings like women, we can own them, but we can't control what they want. Yeah, and we'll talk about the connotations of that in a moment. Then if you look, he moves on and says, I had rather be a toad and live upon the vapour of a dungeon than keep a corner in the thing I love for others' uses. So I'd rather be like a frog or toad and live on the fumes, live on the bad smells in a prison, in a dungeon, than have something that was not fully mine, than to have something that there was part of being used by other people. Okay, so he really thinks if he believes that he can't have Desdemona fully himself, he doesn't want any other men kind of having any relationship with her. And then he thinks again about the position he's in, and he says, it's the plague of great ones. Prerogatived are they less than the base. 'Tis destiny unshunnable like death, even when this forked plague is fated to us when we do quicken. And then Desdemona comes, he sees her and says, Desdemona comes, as in she arrives. This section in green says, 'tis the plague, it's the disease of people who are great. Okay, so it's the plague of those who are important. Prerogative means privileged. Okay, so they have fewer advantages than the base, than the unimportant people, than the poor people. 'Tis destiny unshunnable. Your destiny is your fate, what is going to happen to you. And if you shun something, you ignore it, you shrug it off, you kind of get rid of it. So this is a fate, this is a result that you can't get rid of, like death. Okay, so he says that, actually, people who are important are always going to suffer this awful thing like a disease more than those people who are not important. Because this forked plague, so again, this idea, disease, okay? It's fated to us, we are destined, we can't avoid it when we do quicken, when we're born, when we are alive, okay? So he reckons that this disease of being cheated on, you can't escape, especially if you're important. These women are going to cheat on you. And this idea of the forked is important because context-wise, it refers to the idea of the cuckold. Okay, now, if you've studied this in class, you'll know that the cuckold is a kind of mythical being. And in Elizabethan, Shakespearean, Jacobean times, so at the time the play was written, people believed that if your wife was cheating on you, it was known as cuckolding. Okay, and the cuckold was a being that had horns. And if you were a cuckold, if you were a husband with an unfaithful wife, it was said that you grew horns that you couldn't see, but everybody else could see. So it was this idea of you being the last to know if you are being made a fool of by your wife. And I think that's an idea that we still have today, that, if you're being cheated on, everybody knows apart from you. But this idea that you are being cuckolded and humiliated. And the forked plague, the fork is referring to the horns of the cuckold. And there are several points in the play where Othello refers to feeling horns or having a headache. And it's all a reference to this idea of being cuckolded, being humiliated, growing the horns that everyone can see and you can't. So if we look then at now moving into more analysis of why Shakespeare is using these images and why they're kind of useful, or why this soliloquy is useful if you are writing an essay on Othello, on jealousy, maybe on Desdemona, because of these different ideas. So we know that this quotation, okay, this fellows of exceeding honesty, it means that, Othello is isolated and is relying on Iago. Okay. What he should be doing is he should be asking Desdemona what's going on. He should be kind of, making his own inquiries or so, but he's not. He's relying on Iago. It also means that he's of this kind of free and open nature. He's too trusting and he can't see Iago's plot. He can't see Iago's plans. And so he decides in this kind of almost declaration, okay, so he declares that this is now going to really inform his actions from now on. He is going to be certain of Iago and question Desdemona. And this idea of if, okay, so you've got this conditional here. He's not entirely sure yet that Desdemona is cheating on him. If, that idea of the conditional, okay, so it's conditional. He's not as certain, okay. Here, he's certain about Iago. He's not certain about Desdemona. With the idea of falconry, you move into an extended metaphor. Okay, so now we're thinking Desdemona is hawk. Bird of prey equals a predator. All of a sudden, Desdemona has changed from something beautiful and innocent and beloved to something that is kind of wild and hunting and predatory. You also have ideas of control. Desdemona is now something to be tamed, to be made to obey Othello. And the idea that they are bound together rather than love becomes an image of restriction or maybe confinement. Okay, so once they were kind of together because they wanted to be together, she loved her out of the pity for his stories. I loved her that she did pity them, etc. Now they're actually tied together by something which is one-sided. She's strapped to him and he's prepared to cut her loose. And the idea of him abandoning her is interesting because Desdemona is isolated as well. Okay, her marriage to Othello has ensured that she is on her own. She says when she's in front of the Senate, when she's talking to the Duke, that her current state is that she's with Othello completely. She talks about her violent fortunes and trumpeting, etc. She's entirely on her own. Her father's kind of now estranged from her, and she's in a separate country. And without the protection of her husband, she really would be left to disgrace and possibly death. Now, Othello's not talking about killing her at the moment. He's talking about letting her, as a hawk, kind of take her chances. But he is talking about abandoning her. Later on in the play, she says that, she would be cast off to beggarly divorcement. If Othello abandons her, she'd be a beggar in her divorce. But he is prepared to kind of get rid of her and see what happens. And then these little sections in green here really do show that there's all sorts of insecurities that either he has and Iago has tapped into, Iago has really activated, or that Iago has planted. Because all of his kind of worries, is it his race? Is it his lack of ability to kind of make smooth conversation? Is it his age? And all of a sudden you get these caesura and end stop. So caesura is any punctuation in the line of poetry, and of course this is blank verse, that unrhymed iambic pentameter. And you'll notice that actually this is quite irregular. It's not the kind of 10-syllable, the stresses are all over the place, to show that he's confused and he's kind of really starting to disintegrate. But you kind of start to get this interruption to his fluency. When he was talking to the Duke, when he was talking to the Senate, he was very confident. He was speaking in this beautiful poetry. Now he's kind of almost arguing with himself a little bit here. And here she's gone. It's blunt. It's direct. It's short. It's certain. Okay, it's a pivotal moment. If you have a pivot, think about physics. Okay, there's something, right? If that goes down, that goes up. Here's your pivot. Okay, the point upon which things are turning. And his solution is to be certain. I am abused. My relief must be. Okay, so there's that sense of certainty now. Beforehand, he'd said if. Now I am. I must. We then move into this apostrophe. Okay, this technique with this O is called apostrophe. And it's intense feeling. Okay, it's that kind of gasp of emotion. And all of a sudden, this marriage that had brought him so much happiness is now a curse. Then he moves on to kind of take really what is the superficially Venetian and definitely reflects the kind of Jacobean men's attitude of ownership or possession of women. So you get this kind of curse of marriage that we, so men, and especially kind of privileged men, can call these delicate creatures. Think of also, creatures being things to be kind of owned or creations and that kind of thing. We call them ours and not their appetites. So the idea that you can't control somebody's desires, somebody's thoughts. So Othello is realising that, whatever happens, he can be married, but he cannot control what somebody else is thinking. And that realisation, that knowledge, leads him to the idea that he would rather be a toad living in the kind of bad air of a prison than have Desdemona, than have something he loves being used by others. Okay. Now, if you've done any work on the chain of being, okay, then you might have an idea of how bad a toad would be. So Elizabethans, Jacobeans, had a kind of desire to categorise or to order the world, to make sense of things, kind of, looking at things scientifically, yes. And they had made big kind of lists of orders of things. So at the top you had God, then you had angels, then you had kings, then you had various different people, and then the animals were all ranked. So lions at the top, all the way down to things like reptiles, so toads and snakes and insects. So this idea that Othello, a respected general, is saying that really he would rather be a reptile in a prison living on air than actually have Desdemona being kind of or shared, as it were, is really showing how significant he considers this. And we move from images, ideas of kind of repulsive animals and imprisonment to disease. So the plague of great ones. And we mentioned this before about the cuckold. And really, Othello is kind of comparing what he's suffering to a fatal disease, to something that he can't change, the idea of destiny or fate, the idea that, he's born to be betrayed. And then into all of this kind of psychological chaos or psychological doubt and worry arrives Desdemona, and then walks straight into all of this doubt. So looking at this extract, you can be thinking, how do I use this? Well, you can use it to talk about Othello and Iago. You can use it to look at the imagery surrounding his relationship with Desdemona. You can look at it for context in terms of ownership and falconry and ownership and owning these delicate creatures. You can look at it for the theme of kind of isolation or difference, that Othello is worried about all of these things. You can use it for context in terms of the chain of being, the significance of a toad. You can use it for context in terms of the cuckold and the worry and humiliation that Othello associates with that. But really this is an important speech from Othello in showing how much Iago is succeeding in changing his relationship with Desdemona. I hope this helps.